Welcome to InfoFire, the Fireside chat series from Information Matters. We believe that information matters for our individual survival and collective development as a society. Information is the foundation of all societies and drives the digital society that we live in today. How humans interact with each other and the things around us shapes the present and future directions. Understanding human information interactions is critical to designing and building systems of all kinds from our handheld devices to human society. InfoFire brings thought leaders from around the world and across disciplines to share their views on a chosen topic. Each episode is an interaction between the guest and the host. I am Shalini R, your host for this series. As a faculty of Library and Information Sciences at the University of Mysore, for more than 40 years, I have taught and researched many aspects of information, from cognitive styles to handling Indian language scripts to help users interact with information better. In today's episode of InfoFire, I will be in conversation with Dr. Cary Marchionini, Dean and Distinguished Professor at the School of Information and Library Sciences, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, USA. Hi Gary, welcome to InfoFire. We are happy and privileged to have you, a very well-known expert in the field of information interaction, with us today to chat and then take us through the journey of the evolution of the field of information interaction. Gary,
thank you, Shalini. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Gary, in a sense, your pursuit of this profession or this domain, I would say, of information interaction started right from the day you started your career as a high school teacher teaching mathematics after graduation. I heard that you chose to do double majors in English and mathematics in order to be able to pay attention to both sides of your brain, right? And then your aha moment came when you were observing your student children sort of enthusiastically interacting with the tele typewriters of those days, because you are teaching both maths and programming. And from there, you continued and then pursued your master's in education and then a PhD in maths education, focusing on answering questions such as which is better, whether regeneration or retrieval of a mathematical formula. So you continued your pursuit of this field when you went to the University of Maryland College of Library and Information Services and then moved to the SILS, the School of Information and Library Sciences at UNC. In a sense, I would like to say that, you, with your contribution, was able to bring together or merge three different streams or subdomains of the I field. The information seeking, search and user behavior, which is predominantly, library and information science communities domain. And then the information retrieval, which is at the intersection of information science and computer science and human-computer interaction. So you, in one sense, you have, I would like to use the word, fathered this subdomain of information interaction in the I field, within the realm of I field. So right from your days of a high school teacher, you have always believed that the individual is at the center of this interactivity which you have been pursuing. But then the very notion of information has changed over the last couple of decades, from a thing out there to something that is there in our heads to something which is dynamic, which is in a state of flux. So how would you actually look at this interactivity or interaction studies? How the journey of this has changed over the years with the changing notion of information in the field of whether you look at it from the perspective of information seeking, whether you look at it from the perspective of information retrieval or human-computer interaction. So my question is, can you actually trace some of the milestones or the major phases in the evolution of human information interaction?
Yes, thanks, Shalini, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's been interesting to sort of see how our interactions with information have become not just more important in our everyday lives and professional lives, but how this has really changed fundamentally. In the past, our interactions with information tended to be more sort of one-on-one. I would read a book or consume information personally. I would reflect on it. It would be connected in some way that I may have known the author, a little bit about the author and the context behind the content. But it was mainly a one-on-one kind of interaction. And when search engines and retrieval systems first came on the scene, likewise, our interactions were with, whether it was Lycos in the early days or Alta Vista or some of those early ones to today, Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo et al. It has really changed to actually become social. And I'm going to use social in a somewhat special way because it may not be that I'm interacting with a whole slew of people, but the collective, I think, intelligence of people that has been sort of harvested through these knowledge graphs that have become incredibly large and powerful. And just as importantly, by all the machine computational cycles that are applied to make inferences and connections between the various sort of individual bits, discrete units of information. When I gave the Raghunathan lectures, a decade or so ago in Bangalore, I made the point that libraries, for example, are becoming responsible for collecting people. And I got a lot of pushback from that. And what I really meant by that is that, increasingly, it wasn't just that we wanted libraries to have sort of expert databases which is fine, and that's one example. But that in what we really are moving to is a new kind of information that I call a reflection of self, your identity in cyberspace, which has multiple components that I can talk more about. But the social part is really important because we're not just having a one-on-one interaction with a search engine, but with the collective experience of many, many millions of people who may have done a similar search either recently or in the past, or with the events of the day and the context of the world that is sort of being taken into account as we have these interactions. My colleague, Francesca Tripodi, who's on the faculty here at UNC Chapel Hill, has a nice phrase for this. She sort of studies how search, sort of influences, sort of people's behaviors, especially extreme behavior. She says we've shifted from interaction with the systems being a window so that we can see through to where the information we want or need or seek is, to a mirror. Because so much of what's happening behind the scenes is tuning those interactions to be tuned to us personally. And so it's really reflecting more back on us. And that's not good because it doesn't allow us to then sort of see the broader context and make our own decisions. And so I think this notion of this social interaction is not just social in terms of other people and the things that they've done in the past or are doing right now in this instant, but in all of the machine cycles that are being used, the artificial parts of the many knowledge graphs that are out there. And so that's how I think information interaction has become perhaps richer, certainly more complex, but also maybe a little more troubling because it could lead to homogenization, manipulation, control, which we're all very concerned about in today's world, misinformation, disinformation, and so on. But also, it does work in a lot of ways to make things better, more efficient. So we have this counterbalance between having better efficiency and even efficacy, but also having these possible dangers that have emerged in the way we interact with information.
Yeah, it's, you brought in this concept of the term collective intelligence, but one of the experts in the field, it's nothing but the wisdom of the crowd, etc. But one of the principles of that wisdom or the collective intelligence to be useful is that there should be diversity in the people. So, I'm connecting that to if there is no diversity in opinions, diversity in people, etc., then it becomes, as your colleague said, a mirror or an echo chamber, right? So even the search engines and their algorithms are actually reflecting or mirroring your opinion, your the school of thought that you become, rather than giving you the plethora of options, right? So that is, we have seen that the dangers of that. So moving forward, that is a major challenge, whether you call it as the disinformation, whether you call it as the echo chamber or mirroring your own rather than giving you options, etc. Moving on, how do we actually circumvent this kind of a, as you said, homogenization, or you can even call it as the ghettoization of information silos, right? So you become part of that silo. How do we overcome that? Is it only through machines or algorithms?
Yeah, I think that's the question of our time is how do we overcome the negatives while taking advantage of the positives? We can take some sort of examples. Recommender systems have been around a long time. We depend on them, and they make lots of things easier for us. And so they are sort of cognitive amplifiers. They help our memory. They autocomplete. It has lots of positives, but it also, of course, we know leads to some negatives. So I don't think this is so different than many other things in our world. Technology has always been, it's not value neutral. And so I think what it's one simple solution is just literacy, right? That we have to train people to better understand the ecosystem that they live in and they work in. And so they can make perhaps better judgments on their own. But that's actually, I think, only a part of the solution. If indeed you are being strongly limited to what's going on in the broader world because there is some active censorship and control over what you're able to access, then it's going to be very difficult to sort of say, oh, we'll just do better training programs. So I think what we really need is a combination of technical solutions and social political solutions. The technical solutions are that people may be willing to pay for some privacy. And so, am I willing to give up the sort of quick efficiency of a Google search to do a DuckDuckGo search? Lots of people are. It's a going business, right? So that's sort of a technical kind of solution where we create alternatives that either in reality or at least in our perceptions give us more control over the information ecosystem. The other is to have probably legislative, social, political awareness. And so what we're seeing is national governments across the world are beginning to ask serious questions about this sort of cyberspace world that has become so important to us. And, the pessimist in me would say, well, there will be overreaction and they'll regulate things and slow down progress. But the optimist in me says that will be a counterbalance that together with literacy and more awareness on the part of individual people, technical solutions that arise in the marketplace, that these social political kinds of solutions, that those three elements will continue to lead to progress, so that we won't just stop progressing, but we'll also not go down the rabbit hole of we're all fragmented, being controlled by the great metaverse VR experience in the sky that wastes all my time and basically makes me a non-thinking but happy electronic addict. That's the bad side, right?
See, it's nice that you brought in this issue of solutions in the technical solutions as well as the socio-political solutions. When it comes to technical solutions, such as, let us say, you brought in like Google and then the problem there is, again, the network effect. Because of the collective intelligence that is already there with Google. So sometimes the search is much better, and then, the information that I get is better, even though I know that, privacy is lost there. I would still go to Google. Or I might still go to, like, for example, Facebook or whatever, right? So technical solutions, even though in a pure technical sense, they're possible, because all technical solutions also have a business angle to it, right? So the business angles will actually impinge on the technical solutions as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually what makes it healthy. I mean, in sort of free environments where people can have debate and corporate interests can coexist with individual interests. I think that's the way it's supposed to work. It's always a tension. I mean, that's why the checks and balances in, for example, the U.S. Constitution are so important. That it's not just between different parties and different parts of government, but it's between the private sector, the public sector, individual interests. And so I just think that this is not new. This is where it's new for, in a sense, technology, and that but it is we sort of think that this is somehow never happened before, but it's always happened. I mean, whether it was railroads or the telegraph or electric light bulbs. I mean, there have been all these innovations that have been changed our lives. And there were great social political battles over those things, and certainly some people were harmed, but other people were helped. And I think that's the situation we're in now. I mean, I guess I'm particularly interested in is this sort of tension between homogenization, where we all just sort of become one sort of entity, that which facilitates, efficiency and standards from a business point of view. But the tension between that and customization or personalization, where we all get to sort of blossom as individuals and express our own creativity and interests. And so that tension will always exist. And what I guess I see is a growing new field that I call the digital exposome. So exposomics has been sort of growing for a decade or so. It comes out of sort of the biomedical environmental sort of world, where all of the influences that affect you from birth to death, food, water, air, pollutants, exposures to chemicals, and other people are taken into account in terms of understanding the sort of quality of life. And so, by extension, understanding what the digital exposures are is becoming increasingly important. I mean, there are clinics that treat people with digital addictions or cell phone addiction or what have you. That's sort of one small part of it, but it's actually more fundamental than that. It's how are we actually changing as thinkers, as actors in the world. And I am concerned that the thinking process is being strongly influenced. In some ways, it's quite good. In other ways, we may be homogenized, or we may be limited. So I think studying the digital exposome is crucially important for us in the decades ahead, so that we have some way to get back to your original question about how do we deal with these changes, the pros and the cons, in a way that it gives us some hope of continuing our progress as a species.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about changes that are brought about by other things, like whether it's food, etc. But the changes brought about by information or the medium, as the famous medium is the message goes, right? So there are subtle changes, structural changes that are happening in the way we think, the way we actually behave digitally. Perhaps that would bring us to your concept of proflection. Would you like to elaborate on what is proflection, and also how it has changed over decades? The idea of proflection has changed, especially in social media.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So about 20 years ago, I had a couple of great doctoral students, Fred Stutzman and Terrell Russell, who were working with me. And we were trying to we were thinking about what would be a killer app kind of interface. So we were thinking about the privacy space and how you could actually sort of have an application to manage, your privacy. And those were the early days of the web. And so began to sort of define this notion of your identity in cyberspace. And we had debates. These were early days. Facebook was new. It's like there were sort of two kinds of ways that we project ourselves or our information out into the world. One is conscious. So I send an email. I post a blog message. I tweet. I write an article. Those are conscious things in which I project myself, my thoughts, my information into the world. But there are also many and many more unconscious ways that we project. We call this information leakage or exo information, the stuff that kind of leaks from us, my keystroke cadences, my eye movements, my latent behaviors that I don't even think about. But more and more, those are being collected and tracked, right? And we did eye tracking studies, so we were very aware of the fact that a lot of these kinds of actions are significant because they represent feelings, they represent attention, intensity, if nothing else. And so those are the projections, these two kinds, ones that we're conscious of and those that we're unconscious of. But then there's a second kind of information that comes from us that defines us in the world. And these are our reflections. So you see me in a photograph, you tag me in Facebook, oh, Cary was in Mysore. And that is a reflection of me. So it now is out there, and I may or may not know about it, but it is done by a human. And so there are a lot of these things. Somebody writes a review of your book, or they post a response to an article. Those are the reflections that are more traditional. But then there's a much more pervasive kind of reflection, and this is where the machines come in, because there are trillions and trillions of machine cycles every minute all around the world that are working very hard to try and reflect you and me and everybody else. And so right now it's probably the case that most of those are still disassociated and not exactly mapped into me as an individual person with this DNA makeup and history and behavior and all that. But that's probably happening more and more. And so those kinds of reflections are much more pervasive. So the idea is, if we take these two kinds of projections and these two kinds of reflections that are happening in our world, that we have this coalescence of what I put those words together to be proflection of my identity. And that identity for you is probably somewhat different than the identity for me, because I know myself, or my wife, knows me very well, and probably has a much richer set view of me. Your view, we've known each other for a couple of decades, and so we have a pretty rich understanding. But some stranger, they just have this more amorphous sense of who I am, what I care about, what I love in the world. What about institutions, though? What about my police department? My government, the companies, my bank, my mortgage company. They have also these views of me, and those views used to be, pretty simple and very fixed. Now, people can go out and, do a pretty deep, not beyond a Google search, a deep search on everybody and find out a whole lot of things about individuals. And so we're in this different kind of realm. And I claim that's a different kind of information. That information that is distributed about individual people is a new kind of information. It's not information in the three classic senses that's physical, because it's constantly changing and it's dynamic. It's not information in the head, or the knowledge that the second kind of information, and it's not an act of communicating in terms of the original meaning of information, to inform. So it's not any of the three classical senses. It's a completely new kind of information, and we are really just beginning to grapple with how we go about thinking about that new kind of information, managing it so that it's helpful to us as individuals and helpful to the culture and the world at large.
So in a sense, what you're saying is that we are, our own reflections, our identity, our reflections, whatever you, of a person. There are so many of them. There's not one, right? So when in information interaction studies, you have the individual as one of the elements of that, and then you have the information object, which itself is dynamic. So that means we now have two dynamic entities in this domain of information interaction. The individual in one sense is also dynamic, because we are actually, I would bring in the notion of the concept of network individuality that was proposed by Adolf and Hegel, where we are simultaneously kind of individualistic, at the same time we are network. There is a mediated communication that is happening. So what are the challenges when both are so dynamic? Is it really possible to study interactivity or interaction in such a dynamic situation? That's my, what are the challenges?
Yes, it is, and it's critical that we do. Terrell Russell and Fred and I used to argue about whether that proflection would coalesce into a single one versus having multiple. I argued that we would have multiple, and they convinced me that eventually this really will coalesce. You could have two Facebook profiles, for example, but eventually all you need is one connection, and then that person that you're masquerading as becomes revealed, and the argument was that ultimately must happen. You really can't manage these different identities, and I think they convinced me over time. So I do think this does coalesce, and that's why it is so important that libraries become libraries of people, because I think one of the foundations for libraries as providing not just access to information, but also support for using it is how do I begin to I may not be able to fully curate my own personal identity, but I would certainly want my public library or my academic library to help me understand either its current state and how it is projecting or continuing, and then what steps I might take to somehow manage it or mitigate net negatives at the very least. And so I think that just as a great library will have millions and millions of volumes of collected knowledge, they will have billions of proflections of individuals that I hope will be cared for and preserved in a fair and equitable way. And I don't I don't know how this. You asked how we study this. I think we study it in mixed methods sort of ways. We have to have the transaction logs, the enormous kinds of traces of behavior that the search engine companies and the Amazons and Baidus of the world have, but we usually don't have those that kind of access unless we're in those companies. And so we also have to have the more micro, deep studies of individuals, because I'm fundamentally a believer in the human spirit and human willingness to break out of stereotypes, to try to run against the wind, and so I think that's going to help balance, I think, some of what might be that intense homogenization that could take place. And so studying this at the local level with diary studies, with lab studies of individuals, deep studies that not only do the qualitative work of think alouds, but also the physiological work, eye tracking, brainwave monitoring. I mean, more and more people are using fMRI kinds of studies to it's still awkward, but we'll get better at that, to really have a broader picture of how are we interacting with this information? How is it changing us, or how are we changing it? I mean, it is an interaction. Yeah. And in fact, what makes it an interaction is that both sides change. And so I think understanding and studying that is what I think we're charged to do.
At this point, this is my final question. I would like to bring in this distributed cognition framework, introduced by Hutchins. Do you think that has kind of helped or changed the foundations of this, how we look at interaction? Because what you're saying is essentially a kind of the notion of a distributed cognition.
Yeah, it is. I think the distributed cognition is very much the theme here. I do think the social aspect has been that new element, right? That's what makes it distributed, because it's not just me being distributed, but I'm distributed and connected to hundreds, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of other life forms, and so I think it's kind of more pervasive. This notion of the world brain that 100 years plus old, right? It is. We're a little closer to that, but I think this world we're in is better in many ways. I mean, the fact that I have a confidence that COVID, which has affected so many people and just changed our world over the last couple of years, without our information and knowledge resources, without the sharing of knowledge across scientific communities, without a deeply open and connected scientific and biomedical exchange, we, instead of 6 or 10 million people, however many are dying, it would have been 100 million or many, many more. And I think things like that are evidence that yes, there are many problems we have to solve, but this information is, or data, which is labeled signals, basically, are powerful assets. They're not like oil, though. People make the analogy that information or data is like oil. It's not, because oil is consumable, but information is not. It persists. It can be shared. It can be reused. It can be built upon. And so, we're in a very, I think, positive time. It's a dangerous time, but I'm old enough to have lived through, I think, a few dangerous eras, and I'm sure we'll have many more. And so it's up to us to study, to apply science and scholarship, and try to help future generations to understand the kinds of information environment and ecosystem they live in.
On that positive and optimistic note, Cary, I would like to thank you for your time and for this interaction with you. And with this, I would say thank you. Have a good day. See you soon, somewhere, sometime. As you said, we hope that this is the beginning of the end of pandemic. So let us meet in person somewhere, sometime. Okay, thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Shalini.